The city never really slept, but inside Ethan Cole's glass-walled penthouse, silence ruled. It was the silence of success, the kind that echoed after every applause, after every deal signed, after every victory that left him emptier than before. People called him a visionary, the man who turned steel and sweat into empires. They admired his drive, his discipline, his perfect composure. But behind that sharp-edged smile was a man who had forgotten how to feel. Ethan Cole didn't believe in love. Not anymore. He believed in numbers, contracts, profit margins, the things that never broke promises. His marriage had been an arrangement, a polite transaction approved by his parents. Naomi was gentle, warm, and soft-spoken, the kind of woman who could fill a room with kindness. Ethan respected her, but he never really saw her. To him, she was a checkbox in a family plan, not a heartbeat that needed to be heard. Naomi tried. She truly did. She made his favorite meals, waited for him long after midnight, and whispered prayers for his safety. But every time she reached for him, she touched air. Ethan's heart was somewhere else, locked behind the walls of ambition. 2 years passed in quiet distance. The laughter that once echoed from their dining room faded into the ticking of an expensive clock. Naomi stopped waiting. Ethan stopped noticing. One morning, sunlight cut through the curtains and fell across a table covered in untouched breakfasts. Naomi sat there, her eyes tired but calm. A single envelope rested between them. Divorce papers. Ethan stared at it for a moment, then reached for a pen. There was no argument, no shouting, just the scratching of ink across paper, the sound of a bond ending. He didn't even look at her when he said, "Love doesn't build empires." Naomi's breath caught. She wanted to ask if he had ever tried to love her at all, but the answer was all read. There, in the coldness of his eyes. When she stood up to leave, she carried a small bag and a bigger heartbreak. But before she stepped out the door, she turned back with trembling hands. In her arms was a sleeping child, Ella, their 2-year-old daughter, tiny fingers curled around her mother's necklace. Naomi's voice cracked as she whispered, "She deserves better. Maybe you can give her what I couldn't." Ethan didn't move. He didn't reach out, not until Naomi gently placed the child in his arms and stepped back, tears streaking down her cheeks. The door closed softly behind her, but to Ethan it sounded like thunder. He looked down at the little girl, his daughter. She stirred, sighed, and nestled closer to his chest. Something inside him shifted, something unfamiliar and sharp. For the first time in years, he felt the ache of being human. That night, the mansion was silent again, but the silence was different. It had a heartbeat now, a tiny one that echoed in the crib beside his bed. Ethan stood by the window, city lights reflecting in his eyes. He told himself he didn't need love. He told himself this was enough: money, success, and the promise he'd just made to a woman he'd never really known. "I'll provide for her. You can go." But as the night stretched long and cold, and his daughter whimpered softly in her sleep, Ethan felt something crack deep inside. He wanted to ignore it, to drown it in work, in noise, in anything that wasn't feeling. Yet when he reached into the crib to tuck Ella's blanket, she grasped his finger and refused to let go. The grip was tiny, but it pierced through every layer of pride he had built. He sat there beside her crib until dawn, staring at the child who didn't know she'd just inherited her father's loneliness. Outside, the sun rose over the skyline, lighting the city that worshipped him. Inside, Ethan Cole, the man who had everything, was starting to realize he might have nothing at all. The next few weeks were heavy with routine. Ethan moved through his mansion like a ghost, performing tasks out of necessity rather than care. Breakfasts were eaten alone. Meetings were attended without laughter. His empire continued to grow, but something inside him shrank with each passing day. Ella was the only exception to his coldness. The child's laughter was soft, fragile, and yet it pierced through the armor around his heart. Every time she smiled, he felt a pang, a combination of love he didn't know he deserved and guilt for not giving her mother the warmth she had offered. He tried to distract himself with work, throwing himself into board meetings, phone calls, and international deals. His assistants noticed the change in his eyes, something lost, something restless, but no one dared ask. Ethan thought he could ignore it. He thought he could continue living with precision, with control, with detachment. But a father's instinct has a way of breaking through even the thickest walls. One night, as he walked through the quiet halls, he found Ella's small hands clinging to the bars of her crib. Her eyes were wide, her lips trembling in the moonlight. "Papa?" she whispered, and it was a sound he could never forget. Ethan bent down, brushing the hair from her face, and whispered, "I'm here, little one, always." Her tiny fingers entwined around his, and something inside him stirred, fear, longing, a fragile hope. Sleep became a stranger. Ethan found himself pacing, staring at the city skyline from his floor-to-ceiling windows, wondering if life had always been this hollow. He began noticing the little things Naomi had once done, the warmth of her voice, the patience in her hands, the softness of her smile. Regret settled over him like a shadow, heavy and unavoidable. He had been cruel, detached, unwilling to believe that love could exist for someone like him. But now, in the quiet moments with his daughter, he felt the weight of what he had lost and what he had yet to understand. It was in those moments of silence, those small glimpses of tenderness, that Ethan realized the emptiness wasn't just about Naomi or love. It was about himself. He had built walls so high even happiness couldn't reach him. And then, one afternoon, as he sat in his study staring at contracts he didn't care about, the phone rang. "Mr. Cole?" The voice on the line was crisp, professional. "We have a candidate for your daughter's care. She can start immediately. Shall I schedule the introduction?" Ethan's chest tightened. A new face, a new presence. Someone who would step into the quiet halls of his mansion, into the fragile rhythm he had begun to accept. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of curiosity, of caution, and perhaps of hope. The walls he had built around his heart were not completely unbreakable. And as he agreed to meet the new nanny, he had no idea that this one decision would start to crack the ice around him in ways he could never predict. A month later, the mansion doors opened to welcome someone new, a black nanny whose presence would begin to stir feelings in Ethan he had long buried, and whose smile would make him question everything he thought he knew about love. Ethan watched the grand doors of his mansion open, and there she was, Amara Johnson, poised and graceful, carrying nothing but her small bag and a quiet determination. She walked with the kind of calm confidence that made it clear she didn't need anyone's approval, yet there was something tender in her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability that spoke of a life far from easy. Her first steps into the mansion felt like a ripple across the still waters of his life. Every polished surface, every gleaming fixture suddenly seemed to shrink in comparison to the presse. And she carried with her a warmth that could not be ignored. Ethan didn't move from the shadows as she approached him, her posture straight, her expression composed, yet there was a subtle tension in her shoulders that spoke of hidden struggles. She was not here to charm him. She was here to work, to survive, to give her all to the little girl waiting somewhere in the quiet rooms of this vast house. He observed her with an intensity that made most people uncomfortable, but she did not flinch. She simply nodded once, the faintest hint of respect in her eyes, and said, "Understood, sir. I'll take care of her like she's my own." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight, a promise that echoed in the empty corridors of his mansion. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a flicker of something he had long buried: curiosity. The following days were a study in patience and observation. Ethan watched from a distance as Amara navigated the household, not with the rigidity of a hired employee, but with the gentle authority of someone who truly cared. She moved through Ella's world like sunlight breaking through clouds, softening the edges of his daughter's grief with every laugh, every whispered word, every careful touch. Ella, who had spent months in muted silence, now giggled at Amara's playful antics. She clapped her hands when Amara twirled her around in the living room, her small face lighting up in a way that seemed impossible in Ethan's cold, ordered world. Each burst of laughter was like music, breaking the monotony of the house and slowly of Ethan's heart. Ethan noticed these changes. He tried not to, but it was impossible. Sitting behind his polished office desk, signing papers that meant little to him now, he found himself distracted by the sound of laughter echoing down the hall. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing, chest tight. Something in him stirred, something that had long been dormant. He didn't understand it, not fully. He was not used to feeling warmth that wasn't tied to control or ownership. Yet Amara's presence forced him to acknowledge emotions he had buried under wealth, pride, and relentless ambition. She worked tirelessly, not asking for praise or recognition, simply dedicating herself to the child and the responsibilities she had undertaken. Every morning she arrived before the sun rose, preparing breakfast, ensuring Ella's room was perfect, smoothing down the blankets just so. Every evening she read bedtime stories, her voice soft and melodic, lacing words with care and attention that no one had offered Ella in months. Ethan observed these moments in silence. He told himself it was merely curiosity, a need to assess her suitability, but deep down, he knew it was more. It was fascination. It was something like admiration, though he wouldn't name it, not even to himself. The first night she put Ella to bed, he stood outside the girl's room, pretending to review documents he had no intention of reading. His gaze kept drifting toward the door, listening to the quiet rustle of her movements, the way her voice softened when she whispered instructions or sang softly to the child. He caught snippets of lullabies, melodies carried through the air like memories he had tried to erase. And then he heard it, a song he recognized immediately, one Naomi had sung to Ella when she was a baby. The familiarity hit him like a sharp wind, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt his chest tighten not from anger, not from frustration, but from something entirely unfamiliar. Amara's voice was calm, fluid, soothing. It wove through the room, wrapping around his daughter and somehow, against all his stubborn resistance, wrapping around him as well. He leaned closer to the door, uncertain, caught between the desire to retreat and the need to listen. Her presence was different from Naomi's in ways he couldn't articulate. There was strength in her voice, resilience in her posture, yet softness in every word she spoke to the child. She wasn't just caring for Ella, she was shaping her world with patience and intention. Ethan's thoughts raced, unaccustomed to such intrusion by something as simple as kindness. He had built walls high enough to keep out love, out compassion, out the very things that reminded him he was human. Yet this woman, with nothing but her presence and dedication, had begun to chip away at those walls. He realized he had underestimated the power of someone who cared without expectation, who gave without needing to receive. It unsettled him, this feeling of vulnerability. He had always believed that to feel was to risk weakness, and yet here he was, silently watching, unable to turn away. Days melted into weeks. The mansion felt different now. The halls that had once echoed with emptiness now resonated with warmth. Even the air seemed lighter, charged with a subtle energy that made him aware of his own isolation in a way that was almost painful. He began noticing the small details, the way Amara would pause to adjust Ella's hair, the gentle encouragement when the child struggled with her toys, the careful patience when bedtime tears arrived. Each moment was simple, yet profound, and each one left an impression he couldn't ignore. At night, he found himself standing outside her door again, listening to her humming, feeling a strange pull in his chest. He wondered what it would be like to let someone in, to allow trust to replace suspicion, to allow warmth to replace the cold calculations he had lived by for so long. And he realized something that made him uneasy. He was beginning to care, not in a fleeting way, not in a superficial way, but deeply, painfully, irrevocably. He hated it. He didn't want to feel it. He had survived without it for decades, but every note of her lullaby, every small gesture of kindness toward Ella, every quiet smile, chipped away at the man he thought he had become. Ethan Cole, the unshakable, unfeeling billionaire, felt something stir inside him that he could not name. It was fear, it was longing, it was something. dangerous and exhilarating all at once. He tried to dismiss it. He told himself it was admiration. He told himself it was a passing fascination. Yet when Ella clutched his finger and whispered Amara's name with joy, he felt a pang that no amount of logic could silence. For the first time, he questioned his life, his choices, his relentless pursuit of power. And for the first time, he wondered if perhaps he had been wrong all along about love, about warmth, about what it meant to truly live. There was tension in the air, subtle yet undeniable. Something was shifting, though he could not yet see the full extent. Amara's presence was a quiet storm, gentle yet powerful, reshaping the landscape of his carefully ordered existence. Every day he watched her, every day he noticed her, and every day the impossible became inevitable. The icy walls around his heart were beginning to crack. One night, as Ethan stood silently outside Ella's room, he heard Amara's voice rise in a lullaby, soft, tender, hauntingly familiar, the very same one Naomi had sung. His heart skipped a beat, and for the first time, Ethan felt the pull of something he could no longer ignore. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, the atmosphere in the mansion began to shift ever so subtly. It was not a loud change, not something anyone outside those walls could notice, but Ethan could feel it. A warmth had begun to weave itself into the rigid, cold structure of his life. It was quiet at first, barely there, almost imperceptible, but the presence of Amara Johnson was like the slow drip of sunlight through a winter window, gradual, gentle, and impossible to ignore. Her laughter, once a background murmur, now echoed in the halls, soft and melodic, pulling him from his usual reverie of control. Every gesture she made, every small act of kindness toward Ella, chipped away at the walls Ethan had built around himself. It was infuriating, and yet there was something about it he could not resist noticing. He found himself lingering at doorways, watching her straighten Ella's hair, or guide the little girl through a puzzle with patience that defied all reason. Her voice carried a calm authority, a grace that was at once nurturing and commanding, and though he refused to acknowledge it aloud, he felt it working on him. The weight he carried for decades, the loneliness, the detachment, the conviction that love was a weakness, began to feel heavier, as if her presence illuminated everything he had tried to hide from himself. But Ethan was stubborn. He would not admit to the stirrings in his chest. He told himself these feelings were irrelevant, dangerous distractions from the empire he had built, the power he wielded, the life he controlled. And yet, as he watched her interact with Ella one afternoon, the little girl's eyes sparkling with joy, he could not suppress a flicker of emotion that he refused to name. The mansion, usually a place of strict order, began to feel different. The rooms no longer echoed with emptiness. They carried warmth, anticipation, and the subtle chaos that only life itself could bring, and it unnerved him. One night, the solitude that had once been a shield became a weight. He sat in his office, dimly lit by the city lights spilling through the glass walls, a glass of whiskey in hand. The amber liquid swirled, catching the reflection of his own face, and for the first time, he confronted the emptiness he had been hiding from. It was not about power, not about wealth. It was about being unseen, unheard, untouched by anyone who mattered in a way that went beyond convenience or obligation. Ethan stared into the glass as if searching for answers in the liquid gold. The truth was uncomfortable, and he hated it, but it was undeniable. He felt a craving for connection, for warmth, for something that did not bend to rules or calculations. And in the quiet of that night, a thought took root in his mind, a thought that scared him mad, or than any business risk ever had. He needed someone, just for tonight. A distraction, nothing more. A single night where he could surrender the carefully maintained facade of control and feel something. The sound of footsteps outside his office door brought him back to the present. Amara had come to deliver the evening report on Ella. She entered without hesitation, her posture still composed, her gaze steady, but there was a faint softness in the way she looked at him that evening, a hint of something personal, almost human. Ethan's heart, stubborn as it was, betrayed him. He spoke before his mind could temper the words, his voice low, controlled, yet carrying an edge of vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to hear. Amara. Her name on his tongue felt strange, almost foreign, and yet there was a weight to it that made her pause. "I'll pay you $10,000, he continued, eyes locking on hers, "if you stay with me tonight." The air seemed to shift, heavy with unspoken tension. Amara froze, her hand tightening around the folder she had been carrying. Shock, disbelief, hurt, all passed across her features in a heartbeat. Her breath caught, a silent gasp, barely audible. Ethan maintained his composure, though his chest tightened. He told himself this was business, a simple transaction, nothing more. He would not acknowledge the fluttering in his own heart, the way her presence had already begun to unravel him. Amara's gaze dropped for a moment, and he thought he might have overstepped, that he had gone too far. But then she lifted her eyes, a quiet resolve settling over her features, and whispered, almost reluctantly, "Just one night?" He nodded coldly, the finality in his tone leaving no room for argument. This was not about feelings, he told himself. This was control. This was distance. And yet, as she looked at him, a tremor ran through her body, subtle but undeniable. She agreed, driven by necessity, by her mother's illness, by the harsh reality of the life she had been handed. Her heart trembled, unsure, but she did what she believed she had to do. The days leading to that evening were heavy with tension. Every interaction between them, every glance, every unspoken word seemed to vibrate in the air, charged with anticipation, fear, and something neither wanted to name aloud. Ethan wrestled with himself in the solitude of his office, pacing the polished floors, every thought shadowed by the image of her standing there, agreeing to something he had never dared to voice before. He told himself it was merely a transaction, a necessary indulgence, a single night that would be devoid of meaning. But even as he rehearsed the detachment he would maintain, he could feel the stirrings of desire, of curiosity, of a vulnerability that unsettled him profoundly. Amara, meanwhile, moved through her day with quiet resolve. She did what she always did, cared for Ella with patience, maintained the household with grace, and faced the man who had asked the unthinkable with a mixture of fear and pragmatism. She reminded herself that this was temporary, necessary, and not a reflection of who she was beyond the walls of this mansion. Evening fell like a velvet curtain, casting shadows across the expansive rooms. Ethan found himself in his study, glancing at the clock more than once, aware of every footstep, every muted sound in the mansion. The anticipation was electric, an invisible current threading through the air. He could not tell if it was excitement or dread that tightened his chest. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it was the realization that life, even one meticulously controlled, could surprise him in ways he had long refused to accept. As the minutes crept forward, his mind replayed every detail he had ever noticed about her. The way her voice softened when speaking to Ella, the quiet determination in her movements, the subtle curve of her smile when she thought no one was looking. And he knew, with a certainty, that startled him, that tonight would change everything, whether he was ready or not. The mansion felt alive in a new way, charged with tension, expectation, and the unspoken weight of what was about to unfold. And Ethan, for all his control, for all his arrogance, could do nothing but wait, each heartbeat a drum of anticipation in the silent night. That night, when Amara stepped out of the bathroom in a red silk gown, the sight of her, radiant and poised, made Ethan's carefully constructed composure shatter completely. His heart betrayed his mind, and for the first time, he realized he might have underestimated the power of her presence entirely. The night had begun with calculated intentions. Ethan had convinced himself it was just a transaction, a single night, a fleeting distraction that would vanish by sunrise. He had prepared, rehearsed the detachment he believed he could maintain, the cold barrier he always placed between himself and others. But as soon as Amara entered the room, the air shifted in a way he had not anticipated. She did not carry herself with seduction or guile. There was no attempt to impress, no calculated allure meant to sway him. She was simply present, quietly graceful, and every movement she made seemed natural, unforced, grounded in the reality of who she was. Ethan felt his carefully constructed plans unraveling almost immediately. Her nervous smile, so small and unassuming, struck him more powerfully than any act of calculated charm could have. The scent of her hair lingered as she passed, subtle yet intoxicating, and for a moment he caught himself breathing differently, acutely aware of every detail that made her human and tangible. She spoke softly, her words deliberate, almost hesitant, yet in every syllable there was sincerity. There was no script, no performance. Ethan, who had long relied on control, who had prided himself on dominance in every aspect of his life, found himself disarmed. He realized in that instant that this night would not follow the formula he had envisioned. They sat in awkward silence at first, neither quite knowing how to bridge the chasm between expectation and reality. Ethan's mind, trained to analyze, calculate, and conquer, could not navigate this unfamiliar terrain, and yet he found himself leaning in, drawn toward her, in a way he had not expected, in a way he could not resist. A laugh escaped her lips, light and genuine, when a minor mishap occurred with a glass he had knocked over. It was spontaneous, unguarded, and entirely unlike the world Ethan inhabited. He laughed too, reluctantly at first, then freely, surprised by the warmth that bubbled up inside him, threatening the icy control he had always wielded. Their conversation, initially stilted, began to flow. They spoke of trivial things, Ella's habits, the weather, a book she had recently read, but each word, each gesture, carried a weight that neither of them could articulate. Ethan noticed the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary, the quiet strength that she exuded, even in vulnerability. It was during one of these moments, when her eyes met his across the dimly lit room, that he recognized the truth. She was not like anyone he had ever known. She carried a purity of heart, a sincerity of spirit, that made him feel both admiration and an unfamiliar unease. There was nothing calculated about her, nothing pretentious. She was real, unfiltered, and profoundly human. When their hands met, his tentatively brushing hers in a fleeting gesture, it was not about possession or desire in the way he had anticipated. It was connection, the kind of connection he had long denied himself, believing it to be weakness, and yet, in that simple touch, he felt a spark, a subtle, undeniable pull that anchored him to her presence. The night stretched on, moments folding into one another with an intimacy that was quiet yet electric. Ethan's mind, trained for precision and detachment, struggled to reconcile what he felt with what he had planned. He had expected lust, a hollow indulgence to fill the void of loneliness, but instead he found himself experiencing emotion, emotion that was confusing, disarming, and utterly intoxicating. Amara, too, seemed to navigate her own currents of uncertainty. She was aware of the transaction, of the circumstances that had brought them together, and yet she allowed herself to inhabit the moment fully. There was no cynicism in her actions, no attempt to manipulate or control. She was simply present, authentic, and vulnerable in a way that made every heartbeat in Ethan's chest louder, more insistent. Laughter came easily between them, unplanned and honest, bridging the gap that years of pride and detachment had created in him. For a man who measured life in contracts, profit, and efficiency, this was unfamiliar territory. And yet, he found himself drawn to it, craving the simplicity of human connection that he had long denied himself. He noticed the small details, how she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the way her fingers brushed against the fabric of her gown, the softness in her voice when she spoke of trivial matters. Each observation, though minor, left a deep impression on him, etching her presence into his consciousness in a way that made leaving her impossible in thought, if not yet in action. The night, though brief in the grand scheme of time, felt expansive. It stretched and folded in ways that defied expectation. Ethan found himself revisiting memories of Naomi, of his own past choices, of the walls he had built around himself, and he realized that Amara had begun to erode them silently, irreversibly. By the time dawn approached, he was restless, haunted by her laughter, her voice, the quiet strength she exuded even in moments of apparent fragility. Sleep was elusive. He replayed the night in his mind repeatedly, unable to reconcile his intentions with his experience, unable to suppress the guilt that now mingled with his longing. For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of consequences beyond control or calculation. He understood that he had underestimated her entirely, that this night had changed something fundamental in him. It was not merely desire or temptation that had stirred within him, it was recognition of a heart capable of feeling, of connection, of care that extended beyond obligation or possession. When the early morning light began to filter through the curtains, he watched her sleeping figure, graceful even in repose, and felt an unfamiliar protectiveness, a fierce need to ensure her safety, her comfort. The man who had once prided himself on detachment realized he could no longer ignore the depth of feeling this simple, honest woman had evoked. The mansion felt different now, alive in subtle ways that were previously unimaginable. Shadows seemed softer, sounds warmer, the very air charged with the residue of intimacy that transcended expectation. And Ethan, though exhausted, felt awake in a way that his years of power and control had never achieved. Yet with this awakening came fear, a fear he could not name aloud. He recognized the danger in allowing himself to feel, to be vulnerable, to care for someone beyond convenience or obligation. The power he had once held over his world seemed irrelevant in the face of the emotions that now governed him. As the night ended, the memory of her voice, her laughter, her smile remained etched in his mind. Guilt and longing mingled with fascination, leaving him restless, yearning, and acutely aware of the fragility of human connection he had long ignored. He knew one thing with certainty. He could not allow this to remain merely a night. He could not unhear her laughter, unsee her grace, unfeel the pull she had placed upon him. But as dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight filled the room, a weight settled in his chest. The night had changed him irreversibly. It had awakened a part of him he had believed long dead, and yet he was powerless to predict what she would do in the face of what had transpired, powerless to control the course that was now set in motion. The next morning, Amara handed in her resignation, her eyes steady yet conflicted, leaving Ethan staring at the empty space she once filled, realizing he could not, would not, allow her to leave his life so easily. The mansion felt emptier than it ever had. The echoes of the night before still lingered, soft and haunting, but the space she had filled with warmth was gone. Amara had left. The note she had left behind was simple, concise, and yet it carried the weight of an entire world of emotions. I did what I had to. Please don't look for me. Ethan had read it countless times, each word carving a hollow ache deeper into his chest. He had anticipated leaving her alone would be easy, that detachment was second nature, that his life of control and precision could continue uninterrupted. He had been wrong. There was shame now, a burning fire in his chest that he could not extinguish, shame for the way he had treated her, for the coldness in his voice, for the arrogance that had made him believe he could simply possess her presence without consequence. He realized, with agonizing clarity, that he had treated her like everyone else, like a transaction, like a purchase, like something to be controlled rather than cherished. Every corner of the mansion reminded him of her. The faint scent of her perfume lingering in the living room, the chair she had preferred near the window, the soft rustle of sheets that still carried her imprint. Each memory was a needle to his pride, and he could not escape it. Days stretched into weeks, and he found himself walking the halls alone, restless, searching for the sounds of laughter he now craved. He tried to bury himself in work, in meetings, in numbers, but each distraction was shallow. None of it could erase the echo of her voice or the warmth of her touch. He tried not to think of her, tried to convince himself that it was better this way. But in the quiet moments, when the city slept and his penthouse was nothing but shadows and stillness, her absence screamed at him. It was not just the absence of her body, but the absence of the life she had brought with her, the laughter, the softness, the light that had begun to pierce the darkness he had wrapped around himself. The guilt grew heavier each day. He replayed every interaction, every moment he had treated her like a commodity, every instance he had failed to see her for who she was, kind, brave, unwaveringly human. And the more he thought about it, the more the ache became unbearable. Then one evening, driven by a need he did not fully understand, Ethan left the mansion. He drove through the city streets, the engine of his car barely audible over the storm of thoughts in his head. He did not know where he was going exactly, only that he could no longer endure the emptiness within him. His destination became clear as he approached the hospital. A familiar face, seated beside a hospital bed, brought his heart to a sudden halt. There she was, Amara Johnson. Her shoulders were slumped slightly, weariness etched into the curve of her spine, but her eyes were steady, bright with quiet determination. She was caring for her mother, hands resting lightly over hers, whispering words Ethan could not hear from where he stood. She hadn't noticed him yet. He watched silently, taking in the scene. The tenderness in her gestures, the patience in her movements, the resilience that had always defined her. He realized he had underestimated the depth of her strength, the weight of her compassion, and in that moment, he felt the full extent of his own failings. Finally, her eyes flicked up, and they met his. There was a brief flash of recognition, a heartbeat of surprise, and then she whispered, almost cautiously, "What are you doing here?" Then took a careful step forward, the floor beneath him seeming less solid than the ground he had always trusted. "I came to apologize," he said softly, the words heavy, sincere, and unpracticed. He did not offer excuses. He did not try to justify himself. He simply allowed the truth to lay bare between them, fragile as glass. Amara's gaze softened slightly, but only for a moment. There was wariness there, a line drawn in the space between them that he knew he had crossed, and yet, even in that cautious glance, he saw a flicker of understanding, the faintest recognition that he had finally acknowledged the harm he had caused. He moved closer, unsure, tentative, and yet compelled by a force that had nothing to do with control or desire. He reached out as if to bridge the gap, and in that small gesture there was a universe of apology, of regret, of longing that words could not contain. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the soft rustle of the sheets. Time seemed to stretch, elongate, as they existed together in that delicate moment, caught between past mistakes and the fragile possibility of redemption. Ethan wanted to explain, to make her understand the full depth of his remorse. But no explanation could undo the weeks of absence, the distance he had created, or the fear that lingered in her eyes. All he could do was stand there, hoping that the sincerity in his gaze would speak louder than any words he could find. Amara shifted slightly, her eyes flicking toward her mother, who was lying in bed, pale and weary. Ethan's heart constricted at the sight, the fragility of life reminding him once more of what truly mattered: love, care, and the connections we allow ourselves to form before it's too late. He could feel the tension coiling between them, unspoken but palpable. Each second stretched longer, each heartbeat a reminder of the time he had wasted, of the opportunities he had missed, of the mistakes he had made. Then, as if the universe had decided to test the moment, her mother suddenly began to cough violently. The harsh, rattling sound filled the quiet room, piercing the fragile bubble they had been inhabiting. Ethan's instincts kicked in instantly. All hesitation, all pride, all lingering fear of rejection dissolved. He rushed forward, hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, ready to assist, to protect, to do what needed to be done without thought of reward or consequence. Amara's eyes widened in alarm, her hand shooting toward her mother, and for the first time, Ethan realized that life was far too fleeting to waste on regrets, too fragile to allow pride to dictate actions, too urgent to let love remain unspoken. As Ethan leaned over, trying to help, her mother's sudden violent cough escalated, leaving both Ethan and Amara frozen for a heartbeat, unsure if they could stabilize her in time. The hospital room was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights casting long, stark shadows across the walls. But for Ethan, the brightness had nothing to do with the fixtures above. It was the presence of Amara, the frail but unwavering figure of her mother, and the weight of responsibility pressing down on him that lit a fire he had long buried. That night, he refused to leave. The hours blurred together, time slipping past unnoticed as he navigated hospital forms, medical bills, insurance queries, and the endless demands of care. Each task was mundane, repetitive, yet it grounded him in a reality far removed from the sterile corridors of his corporate empire. Here, there was no boardroom, no profit margin, no contracts to sign. There was only life, fragile and precious, and the consequences of human frailty laid bare. Amara moved around the room with practiced care, yet Ethan noticed every small detail: the way she adjusted her mother's blankets, the careful placement of pillows, the quiet murmur of reassurance she offered in tones soft and tender. Her dedication struck him profoundly, a reminder of how selfless she was, how entirely different from anyone he had ever known. When he glanced at her, she was unaware of his observation, focused entirely on her mother. The sight pierced through his ego, through the arrogance he had always wielded like armor. For the first time in years, he saw something worth caring for beyond wealth, beyond control, beyond himself. Amara finally noticed him when she turned to retrieve a glass of water for her mother. Their eyes met briefly, and she offered a nod that was polite yet guarded. She had seen the man who had demanded a night from her, the man who had treated her like a transaction, and yet, somehow, tonight, he had changed. Somehow, he was different. "You see good in him?" she asked quietly, almost hesitant, as though afraid to hear the answer. Her mother's lips curved into a weak but knowing smile, her voice hoarse from illness, but filled with quiet wisdom. "Sometimes God sends people to break us before he rebuilds us," she whispered. The words were simple, yet they resonated deeply, embedding themselves into Amara's heart. She could not shake the weight of them, the quiet certainty that there was meaning in the way events had unfolded, even in the suffering and pain. Ethan, meanwhile, continued his vigil. He paid for every treatment, arranged every specialist, ensured that the best possible care was available. But it was more than money. It was attention, it was time, it was presence. It was the slow, deliberate act of a man who wanted to make amends in ways that words could not convey. Day by day he visited, not as a billionaire demanding deference, not as a man used to controlling every environment, but as a man humbled, as a man seeking forgiveness, as a man learning the contours of human compassion he had long ignored. He learned to sit quietly, to listen, to offer small gestures that mattered more than grand declarations. He brought flowers, not expensive ones, but simple blooms, chosen carefully to bring light into the room. He offered gentle smiles to Amara, never assuming acceptance, never presuming gratitude. Amara watched this transformation in silent wonder. She had never expected to see him act in ways so genuine, so selfless. His pride, his coldness, his arrogance, they were still there, but softened, eroded by acts of consistent care, by patience, by the effort to be better. Each day, she began to see not the man who had demanded a night of her, but a man struggling to reconcile his past mistakes with the person he wanted to become. And while caution still lingered in her heart, the flicker of hope began to take root. Perhaps this man, flawed though he was, could truly change. Perhaps this was the breaking before the rebuilding, the lesson her mother had whispered. Ethan's presence became a constant, a fixture of the hospital days. He learned the rhythms of care, the little habits of both Amara and her mother. He anticipated needs, offered comfort when illness and exhaustion weighed heavily, and did so with a humility that unsettled him as much as it impressed her. He found himself listening more than speaking, observing more than commanding, understanding more than controlling. The mansion, the wealth, the power, it felt irrelevant here. What mattered was life and love and the small acts that kept both alive in the face of fragility. Amara noticed the way he looked at her mother, the care in his hands, the gentleness in his touch. She noticed how he would linger near the bed, asking questions softly, moving with deliberate patience. Each day, she saw pieces of a man she had thought she knew, fragments of a soul that were emerging slowly, hesitantly, but undeniably. There were moments of quiet laughter, shared between all three of them, moments that were fragile, yet transformative. Ethan learned to navigate the balance between levity and gravity, between presence and intrusion, always mindful of the trust he was rebuilding. As her mother's health improved, so did the tentative bonds between them. Amara could no longer deny the shift in her perception. This was not the man who had demanded a night from her. This was someone else entirely, someone trying, fumbling, struggling, but striving to become better, to make amends, to bridge the gap his mistakes had created. One evening, as shadows lengthened across the room and the hum of the hospital quieted to a gentle rhythm, Ethan approached her mother's bedside. He knelt down beside her with a reverence that caught even Amara off guard. The woman looked up at him, eyes tired but trusting, and then, in a soft, deliberate whisper, Ethan spoke words that made Amara gasp, words meant not for her ears, but for the heart of someone she loved dearly, words heavy with remorse, hope, and vulnerability. In that moment, the room seemed to still, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Time slowed, stretching out the instant, and Amara's breath caught in her throat, uncertainty and something else, something unspoken, coursing through her veins. Ethan's eyes held hers for a heartbeat, and in that glance was a universe of meaning, regret, redemption, and the undeniable truth that he would not allow the mistakes of the past to define what was possible for the future. As Ethan whispered to her mother, Amara's eyes widened in shock, a gasp escaping her lips, leaving the air heavy with unspoken revelation, something that could change everything between them forever. The quiet of the hospital room had settled like a heavy blanket, wrapping everything in a stillness that demanded attention. Ethan knelt by the bedside of Amara's mother, his hands steady, but his heart racing with a vulnerability he had never allowed anyone to see. His voice, usually commanding and sharp, was soft, deliberate, carrying a weight that made the words nearly tremble as they left him. "If you let me," he whispered, "I'll take care of your daughter for life. I want to marry her." The words hung in the air, fragile yet commanding, like a spark poised over a pile of dry leaves. Amara's mother looked at him through tired, clouded eyes, her lips curling into a gentle, knowing smile. Tears streaked down her cheeks, but the warmth in her expression spoke volumes. For her, this was not just a promise. It was a declaration of change, of redemption, and of a man who had finally understood the value of love. Amara, standing a few steps away, felt her heart seize in her chest, speechless. Her mind raced, words failing her at a moment when she needed them most. The sight of Ethan, kneeling there, so open and unguarded, brought forth a storm of emotions she could not untangle. Anger, confusion, a tentative hope she refused to name aloud. "You don't love me," she finally said, her voice soft, trembling slightly. "You just feel guilty." Ethan lifted his gaze, eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air between them hum. There was no arrogance in his expression, no cold calculation, only truth, only raw, unfiltered feeling. "You made me feel again, Amara," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions surging within him. "I can't lose that. Not you, not your daughter. not this chance to be better. The room seemed to shrink, focused entirely on the three of them, the world outside dissolving into insignificance. Amara felt the weight of his sincerity, the depth of his emotion, and for a moment, all her defenses wavered. Could this man, the one who had demanded a night from her, the man who had once treated her like a transaction, truly feel this? Could he truly want more than desire, more than fleeting connection? Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He placed it on the bedside table, the hinge facing Amara, so that she could see it without him needing to force the moment. He did not open it. He did not speak further. He simply walked away, giving her the space to process, to breathe, to consider. Her fingers hovered over the box, trembling slightly. The weight of it felt heavier than gold, more significant than any jewel. It was a choice, a promise, a declaration that demanded more than casual acceptance. It demanded trust, courage, and the willingness to believe in the man standing outside her doubts. That night, alone in her small apartment, Amara sat staring at the ring. The moonlight spilled across the table, glinting faintly off the box's surface. Her mind whirled with questions, doubts, and memories, both painful and tender. Could she trust him? Could she forgive him? Could she allow herself to hope that a man who had once objectified her could now love her for who she truly was? Fear whispered in her ear. She could lose everything, her heart, her pride, her daughter's well-being. But alongside the fear, something else stirred, fragile yet insistent: faith. Faith that people could change, faith that love could grow from the most unexpected places, faith that perhaps Ethan's words, his actions, his presence were not just redemption for him, but a bridge to something beautiful for both of them. Amara traced her fingers over the box, feeling its contours, imagining the moment when she might open it, when she might say yes or no. Each thought brought a new wave of emotion, a new battle between caution and courage. She thought of Ella, her daughter, and the life they deserved, full of care, warmth, and stability. She thought of the man who had risked his ego, his pride, and his heart to show her that he could be more than what he had once been. Tears blurred her vision as she weighed the possibilities. Could love truly arise from such a tumultuous beginning? Could the man who had once been her adversary become her partner, her protector, her equal? She thought back to the moments at the hospital, the laughter they had shared, the tender gestures, the vulnerability he had allowed himself to show. She remembered how he had leaned in not to dominate but to connect, how he had acted with patience, care, and an earnest desire to be better. Those memories, wrapped around her heart like a gentle promise, softening the edges of fear and doubt. The night stretched on, quiet except for the soft sounds of the city outside and the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. She kept staring at the ring, feeling the weight of what it represented. It was more than metal and stone. It was a symbol of change, of possibility, of a future that demanded both courage and trust. Amara finally leaned back, closing her eyes, letting herself imagine a life where Ethan's presence was not a threat, but a source of stability, love, and partnership. She pictured Ella laughing freely, a family that could heal, and the man who had once been distant, arrogant, and closed off standing beside her, not as a possession, but as someone who truly saw her. Doubt still lingered, clawing at the edges of her mind, reminding her that people could hurt again, that intentions could falter, that love could be fleeting. But the faith growing inside her was stronger, a quiet, unyielding flame that refused to be extinguished. Hours passed. Sleep came only fitfully, her mind a storm of fear, hope, and longing. She turned the ring over in her fingers repeatedly, feeling its weight, imagining the words she would speak, the choice she would make. The world outside remained unaware of the decision that was forming in her heart, the silent battle between caution and courage, between past pain and future hope. By morning, the air seemed charged with anticipation. though the city remained oblivious. The ring glinted faintly in the early light, a small promise waiting to be fulfilled. Amara felt a resolve settling within her, a determination to act not from fear, but from faith, to step toward the possibility of love, even when it terrified her. The day passed slowly, each hour stretching longer than the last. Every moment felt like a test of patience, a question of whether she could truly embrace what her heart whispered to her in quiet solitude. And then, finally, she made her decision. With deliberate hands, she slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling the weight of it, the commitment it represented, the courage it demanded. She rose, her heart hammering in her chest, her mind alight with a mix of fear, hope, and determination. The journey to the mansion seemed endless, each step echoing with the gravity of what she was about to do. She rehearsed her words, though she knew none could capture the mixture of emotions coursing through her. The gate loomed ahead, a threshold between uncertainty and possibility, between fear and faith, between past mistakes and the chance for a new beginning. 3 days later, Amara appeared at the mansion's gate, her hand trembling slightly, the ring gleaming in the sunlight, and Ethan's heart stopped the moment he saw her standing there, silent but resolute. The morning sun spilled through the grand windows of the small chapel, casting a golden glow that seemed almost magical. Everything felt impossibly quiet and yet alive, as if the world itself was holding its breath to witness the union about to take place. Amara stood near the entrance, her hands trembling slightly as her mother adjusted the delicate lace of her gown. The softness of the fabric mirrored the vulnerability in her heart, and yet there was a resolute strength in her posture. Her mother's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, warm and reassuring. "You turned a heart of stone into gold," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with pride and awe. Tears pricked Amara's eyes. She remembered the long months of struggle, the nights of doubt, the storm of emotions that had brought them here. And now, standing on the cusp of this moment, all the fears, all the uncertainties, seemed to melt away. Outside, the few guests gathered, their chatter subdued with curiosity and skepticism. Among them were Ethan's friends, some of whom looked less than impressed, murmuring under their breath, "A billionaire marrying his nanny? Really?" Their disbelief floated through the air like a challenge, but Ethan did not falter. He did not flinch. His focus was entirely on the woman standing at the end of the aisle, on the promise he had made silently and openly alike, to love, to protect, to cherish, without reservation. Ethan waited at the altar, tall and composed, but inside, a storm of emotion raged. He had spent a lifetime shielding himself, hiding behind walls of pride and arrogance, convincing himself that love was weakness. And yet, here he was, willing to lay it all bare, to give himself fully, to embrace the vulnerability that had once terrified him. The soft notes of the violin filled the room as Amara took her first steps toward him. Every heartbeat seemed magnified, every breath a symphony of anticipation. Ella, their little daughter, walked beside her, holding onto her mother's gown and smiling, oblivious to the complexities of the emotions swirling around her. Her laughter was a small, bright light, reminding everyone of the innocence and joy that had endured despite the trials of the past. As Amara approached, Ethan's eyes never left hers. He saw every tremor in her hands, every flicker of doubt in her gaze, and yet he felt an unshakable certainty. She was the one he wanted, the one he needed, the one who had opened a door in his heart he thought would remain forever closed. The ceremony began, the officiant speaking words that blended tradition with sincerity, but all Ethan could hear was the sound of Amara's voice whispering softly in his mind, the memory of her laughter, the touch of her hand, the nights spent rebuilding trust and connection. He held her hand tightly when it was his turn, feeling the warmth, the pulse, the life that made him want to be better than he had ever been. Vows were exchanged, words chosen from the depths of their hearts rather than rehearsed lines. Ethan's voice, sane, eddy yet thick with emotion, carried a promise he intended to honor for the rest of his life. "I'll never make you feel less again," he whispered, his eyes locked on hers, unwavering, resolute, and sincere. Amara's own vows reflected the journey they had shared: hesitation, fear, acceptance, and finally, trust. She spoke of love that had grown from pain, of forgiveness, of a belief that people could change if given the chance. Her words, soft but powerful, seemed to resonate through the chapel, touching everyone present, including those who had doubted the union. Ella, unable to contain her excitement, clapped her hands joyfully, the sound ringing like music through the room. The little girl's laughter was contagious, a reminder of why this day mattered, of the family they were creating together, of the joy that could be found even after hardship and uncertainty. The simple act of placing the ring on Amara's finger was heavier than any contract, more significant than any corporate deal. It was a promise, a lifeline, a bridge between past mistakes and a future they could create together. Ethan felt the weight of it, but not as a burden. It was a responsibility he embraced gladly, willingly, and with all the sincerity of a heart that had finally learned to feel. The ceremony concluded, and applause filled the room, echoing in celebration and acknowledgement. Ethan lifted Amara's hand, pressing a gentle kiss to it, savoring the warmth, the softness, the reality that she was now his, not as a possession, not as a reward, but as a partner, a beloved, a family. Guests offered congratulations, their voices blending into a blur of sound, but Ethan and Amara were lost in their own world. Their eyes spoke volumes, their smiles reflected shared understanding, and their hands remained intertwined as they moved through the crowd. Every step was deliberate, a declaration of unity, of love, of shared strength. Even as some of Ethan's friends continued to whisper disbelief, he remained untouched by their skepticism. For the first time in his life, he felt free, not from responsibility, not from challenge, but free from the chains of pride, fear, and past mistakes. He had chosen love, he had chosen vulnerability, and he had chosen Amara. The day passed in a blend of laughter, tears, and quiet moments of intimacy. Private glances exchanged, whispered words of affection, and small gestures of care strengthened the bond that had been forged in trials, challenges, and moments of shared humanity. Amara's mother watched silently, tears streaming freely now, her heart full of joy and relief. She had witnessed the transformation, the slow but undeniable change in Ethan, and she felt gratitude that her daughter had found a man capable of seeing her, of loving her, of honoring the life they would now build together. Evenings in the mansion after the wedding were filled with warmth. Candlelight reflected off polished surfaces, shadows dancing gently as Ethan and Amara shared quiet conversations, soft laughter, and moments of touch that reminded them both of the journey they had undertaken. Every day was a discovery, a reminder of love's resilience, and a testament to the power of trust and vulnerability. Little Ella thrived in the new dynamic, her laughter and playfulness a constant source of joy. The bond between father and daughter, mother and daughter, husband and wife grew stronger with every shared meal, every bedtime story, every evening spent in quiet togetherness. Ethan found himself smiling freely for the first time in years, his arrogance softened by tenderness, his pride tempered by the responsibilities of love and family. Amara, in turn, found herself letting go of fear, embracing trust, and stepping fully into a partnership that promised safety, passion, and unwavering commitment. The honeymoon phase of their marriage, brief as it was, revealed the depths of connection possible when hearts were open and intentions sincere. They learned each other's rhythms, shared dreams, and explored the intimacy that had once been denied, now available in abundance and freely given. They celebrated small victories, daily joys, and quiet triumphs, building a foundation rooted in forgiveness, understanding, and shared vulnerability. Every glance, every touch, every word reinforced the choices they had made and the promises they intended to keep. Yet even amid happiness, the fragility of life remained a subtle undercurrent. a reminder that challenges could arise at any moment. They had endured so much, and now, in the serenity of contentment, the world whispered that even the brightest moments could harbor uncertainty. The mansion felt alive with love, laughter, and the promise of a future crafted together. Each corner seemed infused with their presence, each object a silent witness to their commitment, each room a sanctuary of shared triumph over fear, pride, and past mistakes. After 3 months of blissful happiness, one ordinary morning, Amara collapsed in the kitchen, unconscious, leaving Ethan panicked and desperate, unsure if the life they had just built could withstand this sudden, terrifying crisis. The morning had begun like any other, sunlight spilling through the windows, the aroma of fresh coffee lingering in the air. But within moments, everything changed. Amara had been moving around the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast, when her legs gave way beneath her. 1 second she was standing, the next she was crumpled to the floor, her body limp, her consciousness slipping away like water through clenched fingers. Ethan's heart exploded in his chest. Shock, fear, disbelief, all collided as he caught her just in time, holding her close, whispering her name with desperation that made the room feel impossibly small. "Amara, stay with me. Look at me." His voice was frantic, echoing off the walls, each syllable laden with panic. He scooped her into his arms, moving as if the world itself had slowed. Every second felt stretched, every heartbeat a hammering drum of terror. Her weight in his arms was nothing compared to the fear he carried, the fear of losing her, of failing the one woman who had taught him how to feel, the one woman who had transformed his heart from stone to something tender and alive. The drive to the hospital was a blur. The city streets rushed past in streaks of light, but Ethan barely saw anything. His focus was entirely on Amara, on her shallow breaths, on the pallor of her face, on the life he could not imagine losing. His hands never left her, adjusting her position gently, whispering words of comfort, praying silently, asking for mercy, for protection, for a miracle. The hospital entrance came into view, bright and sterile, and Ethan's feet moved as if by instinct. Nurses and doctors sprang into action, whisking Amara from his arms and guiding her onto a gurney. He followed closely, pleading with them to be careful, to hurry, to save her. The sounds of medical machinery, beeping monitors, and hurried footsteps surrounded him, but he barely registered any of it. All that mattered was her. Time blurred as they moved through corridors, her limp body in his hands, his mind spinning with memories of their first meeting, the nights they had shared, the trust she had given him, the love that had grown despite pain, the daughter who would need her mother. Every thought was a dagger, every memory a reminder of what was at stake. Finally, they reached the emergency room. Doctors worked quickly, their calm efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos in Ethan's mind. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. He could not sit still. He could not breathe properly. Every small sound, the beep of a monitor, the shuffle of a nurse, the rustle of sheets, made him jump, each second dragging him deeper into the abyss of fear. When the doctor finally emerged, Ethan's heart stopped. His throat tightened, words failing. Him. The man looked serious but not alarmed, a careful balance that both eased and heightened Ethan's panic. "Congratulations, Mr. Cole," the doctor said, voice calm but deliberate. "Your wife is pregnant." Ethan laughed and cried simultaneously, a torrent of emotions spilling from him in uncontrollable waves. Relief, joy, disbelief, gratitude, it all collided, leaving him trembling and weak. He felt tears streaming down his face as he sank onto a chair, clutching his hands, trying to absorb the miraculous news. Amara was carrying his child. Their love had created life, a tangible symbol of hope and healing. But joy, as often happens in life, came paired with fear. The doctor's expression shifted slightly, subtle but unmistakable. He cleared his throat and added carefully, "There's a complication. We'll need to monitor her closely." Ethan's mind plunged into panic once again. complication, risk, danger. The words clawed at him, pulling him back from the elation he had just felt. He rose immediately, refusing to sit, pacing the sterile floor, repeating silent prayers, demanding silently that no harm come to the woman who had saved him in ways he could never repay. Hours turned into nights, days blurred into one another. Ethan did not leave her side. He slept in a chair beside the hospital bed, his body aching, his eyes heavy, but his heart relentless. He watched monitors, listened to every breath, held her hand, stroked her hair, whispered her name constantly. Every small rise and fall of her chest was a victory, every slight movement a triumph. Amara, for her part, remained fragile but conscious intermittently. Her eyes opened briefly, meeting his with a mix of trust and exhaustion. Her lips curved into a faint, weak smile, but that smile was enough to give him strength, to remind him why he had changed, why he had fought to be better, why he could not, would not, let her slip from his life. When she finally opened her eyes fully, the first words Ethan whispered were soft, raw, filled with remorse. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice shaking. Response was equally simple yet profound, carrying a truth that shook him to his core. Love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing. The words hung in the air like a promise, a lesson, a reminder that love transcended guilt, pain, and fear. And in that instant, Ethan realized that every mistake, every misstep, every moment of arrogance had led him here, to a love that demanded nothing but faith, patience, and dedication. He held her hand tightly, not letting go, feeling the warmth, the life, the presence that meant everything. He whispered over and over, "I will protect you. I will never leave you. I will love you beyond measure." Days of monitoring passed. Doctors came and went, charts were filled, vital signs tracked meticulously, and Ethan remained vigilant, unrelenting in his devotion. Every smile, every flutter of her hand, every sigh of relief from the medical staff reinforced his resolve to be the man she deserved, to stand by her side regardless of fear or consequence. Amara, slowly regaining strength, became aware of the depth of his commitment. The man who had once demanded, who had once been distant and self-absorbed, was now unwavering, tireless, devoted beyond measure. And in that, she found both awe and comfort, a renewed faith in the love that had grown between them. As she rested, she felt his presence constantly, his whispers, his soft assurances, his hand gripping hers, his eyes watching her every movement with intensity and care. It was a love forged in trials, hardened in fire, and tempered by vulnerability. Every day that passed without crisis felt like a miracle. Every moment of stability was a gift. Ethan never left her side, learning the rhythms of care, the signals of need, the nuances of her discomfort and reassurance. He became attuned to her like no one else ever had, and through it all, the child they were bringing into the world became a beacon of hope, a life forged from love and redemption, a symbol that even after storms, beauty could emerge. But the calm, as it often does, was fragile. The days of relief were only temporary reprieve, a quiet before the storm. Ethan knew it in the back of his mind, a silent dread that refused to dissipate entirely. Months later, as Amara went into labor, the monitors began to scream alarms, her vitals spiking dangerously, and Ethan's heart raced with terror, knowing that this birth could change everything in an instant. The delivery room was a storm of controlled chaos. Monitors beeped frantically, nurses shouted instructions, and the scent of antiseptic mingled with the raw, electric tension in the air. Ethan's world had narrowed to a single point: Amara. Her face, pale yet resolute, glistened with sweat, eyes squeezed shut in a mixture of pain and determination. Every breath she drew was a battle, every movement a testament to strength he had never fully appreciated before. He gripped her hand like it was his lifeline, knuckles white, heart pounding in a rhythm that matched hers. "Don't leave me, Amara," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, stay with me. Please." His words were raw, vulnerable, stripped of arrogance. For the first time in years, he admitted fear, not of failure in business, not of loss of status, but of losing the woman who had become his world. The doctors barked instructions, their voices clipped, urgent, and professional. Ethan nodded absently, barely registering the words, his focus entirely on the woman whose courage dwarfed his own. He felt her trembling under his hand, her pulse thrumming with determination, and it struck him with overwhelming force how much he loved her, not the idea of her, not the image he had once held, but her raw, real, indomitable presence. Minutes stretched into eternities. Every second was a fit time, every breath a battle against dread. Ethan whispered prayers he hadn't spoken in years, calling on God, luck, fate, anything that might protect her, keep her safe, and bring this child into the world unharmed. His eyes never left hers, tracing every flicker of pain, every glimmer of resolve. Her face contorted, sweat dripping into her hairline, and he leaned closer, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple despite the chaos around them. I'm here. I'm not leaving. I love you. You've given me everything. We're almost there, he murmured, his voice a lifeline amid the storm. Nurses and doctors moved with precision, their focus absolute, but Ethan could feel every second, every movement, every tense heartbeat like a drum line in his chest. The room vibrated with urgency, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Every scream of instruction, every beep of a monitor, every small gesture of care became monumental in his perception. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, a sound cut through the chaos, a cry, sharp and strong, piercing through the tension like a ray of sunlight breaking storm clouds. Ethan froze. The baby's cry. A healthy, alive, perfect sound that made the world stop spinning, that made every fear, every second of anxiety, every sleepless night, every moment of uncertainty vanish into nothing. Tears sprang unbidden to his eyes, blurring his vision, and he let them fall freely. He pressed a trembling hand to his face, shaking with relief, joy, and overwhelming gratitude. It's a boy, he whispered, voice thick, barely audible over the hum of the room. The doctor smiled, handing the tiny, wriggling life into Amara's arms. Ethan knelt beside her, his own hands brushing gently against the small body, feeling warmth, life, and the tangible result of love he had once doubted could exist. He kissed Amara's forehead softly, his lips lingering in a silent apology, a promise, a profound declaration of devotion. You gave me everything I didn't believe in, he said, voice choked with emotion. Love, family, faith, you made me whole. Mara smiled weakly, her body exhausted, her spirit triumphant. We did this together, she whispered, eyes brimming with tears of her own. You chose to be here. You chose love. That's all that matters. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, their bodies trembling together in relief and overwhelming emotion. The tiny boy nestled between them, his cries now mingling with laughter, tears, and whispered promises. In that moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only family, love, and the miracle of life. Weeks turned into months. The house was filled with laughter, tiny footsteps, and the gentle rhythm of new life. Ethan found himself seeing the world differently, through Amara's eyes, through the eyes of the child they had created, and through the heart that had learned to love fully and without reservation. He began taking steps to ensure their story could inspire and help others. Using his wealth and influence, he founded a charity in Amara's name, dedicated to supporting struggling single mothers and nannies, ensuring that no one else would have to face the battles she had endured alone. The man who had once believed love was weakness now built an empire on compassion, empathy, and the understanding that true power came from lifting others, not controlling them. Every day brought new moments of joy. Ethan watched as Ella and the baby bonded, as Amara rested in peace, knowing she was surrounded by love and protection, as his friends, those who had once mocked him, began to understand the depth of his transformation. Evenings were spent in quiet togetherness. Candlelight flickered across the rooms, laughter mingled with soft whispers, and moments of tenderness reminded them both of the journey that had brought them here. Ethan held Amara close, never taking for granted the fragile, precious life they now shared, and every night he thanked fate, chance, or God for giving him a second chance at love. The mansion, once a symbol of cold power and isolation, now pulsed with warmth, life, and laughter. Every corner seemed infused with joy, every room a psalm, testament to healing, redemption, and the miracle of love. Amara, radiant in her strength and beauty, watched Ethan as he cradled their son, tears glistening in her eyes. She whispered softly, "You've changed, Ethan, not just for me, for all of us." He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, the arrogance and hardness of his former self nowhere to be found. "You changed me," he replied. "You made me believe in what I never thought I could." Days turned into months, and life settled into a rhythm that was both extraordinary and ordinary, full of laughter, love, and small, tender moments. The family grew stronger with each passing day, and the love between Ethan and Amara deepened, tempered by trials, cemented by trust, and celebrated through shared joy. Ethan often reflected on the journey, the mistakes, the arrogance, the pain, the passion, the redemption, and the miracle that had reshaped his life. Every challenge, every heartbreak, every sleepless night had led him here, to a man capable of true love, compassion, and devotion. And as he watched Amara cradle their son, smiling down at him with eyes full of love, he realized that all the power, wealth, and ambition in the world could never compare to the miracle they had created together. A family born not just from desire, but from choice, faith, and unwavering love. The charity thrived, lives were changed, and their story became an inspiration to those who believed that love could heal even the hardest hearts. Ethan's empire, once defined by control and business, was now built on generosity, empathy, and the understanding that the greatest power in life was to give, to nurture, and to love fully. And in quiet moments, late at night, Ethan would hold Amara close, their hearts beating in unison, and whisper the truth he had learned through fire, pain, and joy, that the one he had once thought beneath him, the nanny, the woman he had underestimated, was the very soul who had lifted him higher than he had ever imagined. Sometimes the one you think is beneath you is the one sent to lift you higher.